Welcome to the third week of the IPI World Congress. Reminder to those of you who just recently joined, this is IPI's 69th Annual World Congress and our first virtual one. Over the past 2 weeks, we have taken deep dives into what might determine the success of news media today, in tackling some of journalism's major challenges, from disinformation to working with the platforms to COVID-19 driven restrictions and the impact of authoritarian populism. This week, we'll discuss politics with some of the world's biggest media thinkers and innovators, from elections to leaders and to the politics of journalism. Today, we'll start with a conversation about covering two game-changing political leaders who have treated the news media and journalists as the enemy: US President Trump and India Prime Minister Modi. With us as speakers are Steve Coll, Dean of the Columbia Journalism School and a writer for the New Yorker, and Siddharth Varadarajan, the founding editor of The Wire in Delhi. The conversation is moderated by Anita Pratap, contributing editor of The Week in India. Right after, starting at 5 p.m. Central European Standard Time, Summer Time, which is 1 hour from now, remain tuned for a special panel on reporting on the biggest elections of the moment, the 2020 US presidential elections. We'll have 3 leading US editors and journalists for a conversation moderated by the editor of The Guardian US edition. You can join the conversation right now by posting your comments or introducing yourself in the chat box and ask your questions, panelists, through the Q&A box. Our moderator will bring your questions to the panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Anita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, or should we say the screen is mine. Thank you so much, Barbara, for the wonderful introduction. You know, journalism has always been dangerous, whether it's in the war zones or in authoritarian regimes. But when press freedoms deteriorate in the world's most powerful democracy, United States, or in the world's largest democracy, India, then democracy itself is in danger. So here we are to talk this very, very important issue, and we are so lucky to have 2 eminent journalists with us. I would just like to use a little more, both our panelists, only because they are so eminent. We have Steve Coll, who is the author of 8 books, and he is a Pulitzer Prize winner twice. And he was the managing editor of the Washington Post, and of course now is the Dean of Columbia Journalism School. And we have Siddharth, one of the most distinguished journalists that India has produced. And he was the editor of the Hindu newspaper, which was one of the leading newspapers in India, and the founding editor of The Wire, which is a gutsy independent news website. Thank you both for being here today. I think is an existential issue for independent journalism. So if I could start with you, Steve, you've reported from many war zones. Describe to us one terrible day that you experienced in reporting from a war zone.
Well, apart from the adventures that you and I had traveling around you know, I suppose probably the most difficult day of combat I had to work through, and I'm not, you know, primarily a war correspondent. I just have happened to be in a lot of conflicts in my career. In Kabul, after the city fell to the Mujahideen in 1992, you know, a very intensive civil war with armor, tanks, and artillery started downtown, and you know, a couple of journalists were killed while I was, you know, among them out on the streets. It was a very violent conflict for a few days. As you know, a lot of small wars can pop up at you, and they have a kind of low intensity aspect that can be very dangerous to navigate as a journalist. But being in the middle of a tank battle is something else altogether. But reflecting on the meaning of that in the context of this discussion, I think what I would say is that I felt very fortunate in retrospect to belong to a generation of correspondents who were not the targets. A couple of colleagues died in that couple of days in Kabul, but nobody was shooting at them. They just were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that role of journalists is seen as kind of independence, equivalent to humanitarian workers, able to wave a white flag, to mark their vehicles as press and be off limits, has obviously vanished, in part because no longer are seen as necessary by combatants to get their stories out. They can use digital media to tell their own stories. But also, increasingly in this decade, because of the rise of authoritarians around the world and in a democracy like the United States, a president who is in a complicated way hostile to the press. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later, Steve. I just want to go to Siddharth and describe to us a particularly bad, tense day in your Delhi office.
Well, I mean, tension can take any forms for a reporter or a newsroom. What we definitely do not like is when the postwoman or postman comes in with a special delivery, a whole bunch of envelopes carrying fat bundles of green-leaved court papers, which basically connotes the fact that somebody has gone and filed a criminal defamation case or a civil defamation case, usually for a fairly innocuous article from our point of view, and one that's been thoroughly vetted, but which enables a concerned party to tie us down with frivolous litigation. So it's not the fear of having a day in court or the fear of incarceration or any such thing, but just the sense that oh dear, now we're going to be tied down, wasting hours and money that we don't have to prepare all the necessary legal responses. Because in India, the form that pressure on the media can take is to down the procedure. Right? So process is punishment. You don't expect that a trial you will ever be found guilty because of these cases.
Yeah.
But
so the green files of harassment, as you call it, is as lethal as bullets. And what you're saying, Siddharth, actually ties in very much what the Global Press Freedom Report says. It has ranked India at 1-2 out of 180 in terms of press freedom. And the reason it has given, this report has given for this low rankings, is that because of the increased pressure on the media to toe the line of the Hindu nationalist government. Describe to us what this pressure is like.
Well, pressure takes various forms. I mean, you have a section of the media, which we never had earlier, which is actually quite happy to bat on behalf of the government. So there is a large section that does the government's bidding quite willingly and quite enthusiastically. And then you have, I would say, a large section that is kind of on the fence, that would like to be aggressive in its reporting and would like to be, essentially a vigilant watchdog, but whose proprietary owners are scared of retribution of one form or the other. A lot of media proprietors have secondary or tertiary business interests in different areas, and government regulation and tax policies being what they are, it's quite easy to ensnare a media proprietor in some kind of investigation or some kind of a case, and many of them are naturally quite risk averse to doing that. And then you have a third section, which is small and mobile. It helps that we are non-profit, so the levers of pressure are much less on us. But so we face legal harassment of one kind or the other. But essentially, there is a lot of pressure on the media to conform and to not ask questions.
Correct. And in 2018, Steve, for the first the United States joined the ranks of the most dangerous countries for journalists to operate. Why have attacks against the media increased so much in the US?
Primarily incitement by the president, who has repeatedly referred to journalists as enemies of the people and has sought to delegitimize their function in our constitutional system, weekly, if not daily. And we do live, as in India, in a time of intensely polarized politics in the US. And so there is a following of that the president enjoys that is ready to believe and to adopt and act on the views that he prioritizes. And one of the views he's prioritized is attacking the press. And you see this now again and again on the ground, especially in the summer of social unrest we've had in the United States, where legally credentialed reporters, clearly identified and wearing credentials and other clothing to mark them out as journalists on the ground, are nonetheless being arrested and manhandled by police in the course of doing their. And they're also sometimes subject to harassment and even physical attack by citizens. Now, I don't want to paint too dark a picture of it, but the rate of attacks and the linkage between the president's incitement and occasional very violent attacks is disturbing, and it's clear. There was a bomb sent to CNN's office within the last 2 years that was sent by someone who identified himself very thoroughly as a follower of the president, seemed to be acting on some of his rhetoric. So it is a disturbing environment. And I do think, just to pick up on what Siddharth was saying about that kind of indirect pressure that comes on media companies, where the government uses its economic leverage to force publishers to toe the line or risk economic losses in other lines of business. You see that in Turkey and Brazil, lots of places. President Trump has actually attempted that in the United States. He's gone after Amazon, threatened to raise their postal rates. He's attacked their bids for government contracts, and he's tried to suggest that he would bring anti-monopoly cases against networks like CNN that he doesn't like. Now, it hasn't been as effective. The government has fewer levers to pull here, and these businesses are more economically independent. But I think that if he were reelected, and if this methodology of his were to continue for another 4 or perhaps 8 years in the hands of a successor, or in his own hands, the Constitution, you would see similar to what Siddharth was describing about the reality in India today.
The Reporters Without Borders has said that one of the most alarming things is the way Trump has demonized the independent media, and this has gone viral around the world. So there are heads of some 50 countries, 50 countries, who use the label of fake news to muzzle independent media. How one man, Trump, able to do this to America?
Well, he's a performer. He had his own television show for many years. I think someone told me the other day, he did more than 190 episodes of The Apprentice. He has been a creature of the media since he was a very young real estate developer in New York. And if you are reading any of the bombshell coverage that the New York Times has published this week about his taxes, one of the lessons is that to the extent he had a business that was profitable, it was the business of being famous. And when we think about Trump's relationship with the media in the US, it's complicated because he needs the media. He craves the media. He can't let go of the media, even as he demonizes them. And so I think Americans have a sense of some of the subtleties in his performance and some of the self-interestedness and the repetitions. But the problem, as you point out, is that globally, the language he uses lands and resonates in other countries where there is even greater impunity for attacking the press violently. where there are authoritarians who seek to muzzle the press in order to carry out, very aggressive extra-constitutional policies and to make sure that nobody holds them accountable. And so, Donald Trump, in my opinion, has done an enormous amount of damage to the Constitution and particularly to the function of the press in the United States. But I think he's done even greater harm by normalizing this kind of hostile rhetoric and incitement and allowing authoritarians around the world to use it, pointing to the legitimacy of the United States as a basis for holding these views and using this kind of language.
Siddharth, how is Narendra Modi, different from Donald Trump when it comes to the media?
No, I think Modi is a much smarter player for the simple reason that he is pretty guarded in his own personal pronouncements. So it's very rare over the last 6 years that he's been prime minister that you could come across overtly hostile comments by him about the media. So that job is sort of outsourced to other ministers or to people who are part of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party's sort of information technology cell, or essentially, I mean, there are other people who play that role, but but there is undisguised hostility between the government and the media insofar as the government doesn't believe, for example, Prime Minister has never held a single press conference in the 6 years he's been Prime Minister. He's given a few interviews, but all of them have a very scripted feel. So he never allows himself to be in a situation, an unguarded situation where a question could be put to him that he has not already prepared for. And I think the fact that perhaps this is a global phenomenon, have perfected the art of one-way communication through Twitter and of course Facebook and YouTube and so on, enables them to be quite cavalier with the media. So they don't need the media in the way that they used to in the past. And they are pretty resentful of any section of the media that even questions the narrative. So it's a very much, if you're not with us, you're against us kind of attitude. So we at The Wire or others frequently get accused of being doing the opposition's work or being or batting on behalf of the Congress party, which is utter rubbish. But these are allegations that are flung, but Modi himself is quite careful not to abuse, directly confront the press the way Trump.
Right. Steve, when journalists are, it's terrifying when journalists are killed, when they are doing their job. It is even more terrifying when their killers go unpunished. What are the consequences of this culture of impunity that is spreading, and keeping in mind especially the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, I mean, thank you, Anita. I mean, this pattern of impunity in attacks on individual journalists and the murder of individual journalists has been with us, unfortunately, through much of the last 20 years, certainly, that I've been engaged with these questions. And the consequences are that it obviously sends a signal to authoritarians and their violent ally that when they feel that it's necessary to silence the press violently, they won't likely face accountability in their systems of national justice, and that in the international justice system, there's virtually no accountability other than naming and shaming and advocacy for unjustly imprisoned reporters around the world, which can be effective, but it can be a slow process. And as leaders like Donald Trump seek to delegitimize the function of journalists around the world, it gets harder to be effective with campaigns on their behalf. Now, thank you for mentioning Jamal Khashoggi, who I knew reasonably well. I'm sure you might have as too from your time living in the kingdom. Jamal, of course, was murdered by what an independent UN investigation indicates was a state-sponsored hit team that was sent to trap him and kill him and dismember him in a consulate in Istanbul. And it's good to be talking about him today, not only because I welcome to remember him and to note that there is no yet, despite a closed trial in Saudi Arabia, any meaningful accountability that's come forward for those who conceived and participated in this murder. But also it's just interesting that today, the other side of Jamal, not just the victim of this terrible crime, but the public intellectual in an Arab society that doesn't have a lot of breathing room for challenging ideas, that a group of his friends and allies today launched a movement that he had been working on in the year before his death, which was to try to forward a serious conversation about democracy in the Arab world. And that's a whole nother panel that we will avoid turning this one into. But I just wanted to note that launch is a really important event. It's a complicated history. Jamal was a complicated public intellectual in a lot of ways, but a truly admirable and independent thinker. And above all, as you would know if you knew him, just an incredibly gentle soul, the least likely person to have had his time on earth end the way it did. So anyway, in memory.
Right. Siddharth, it's not just governments, that is after you, that is disturbing in itself and very difficult to cope with, but it's also all these cultural and moral vigilantes that start hammering and harassing you. You're like surrounded by all these physical as well as online trolls. How do you cope with this pressure? Are there any, emotionally, how demanding and how terrible is this? And also, are there any institutions or celebrities or organizations who come to defend face pressure from all sides?
Sadly, we are right now in a situation where freedom of speech and expression is under all-round assault. It's not just the media that's feeling the pressure. Students on campuses, academics, and cultural workers, the film fraternity, writers. There is a sense in which the climate has become much more intolerant of differing points of view, differing analyses and takes on whatever is happening. Movie makers think twice about tackling sensitive topic because they're afraid of angering some interest group or the other, which probably has political backing. So the public sphere has gotten pretty fraught. I wouldn't say that this is the product of just Modi's years. It's been a long time in the making, but it's become much more vicious over the last 6 years because pressure can take a wide variety of forms. There could be physical, overt physical pressure. Colleague of ours, Gauri Lankesh, who was a Karnataka-based editor and journalist, was shot dead 3 years ago, or Shujat Bukhari in Jammu and Kashmir. So there are physical attacks and assassinations of journalists that have happened. But there is also a lot of trolling. There's a lot of frivolous cases that are filed. So it's not just the state that may come after you, but you may have some private individual somehow managing to get the police into action. And so there's a lot of this kind of harassment which has had a chilling effect on free speech across the board. And the media, of course, feels the pressure, but in some ways we are well equipped to deal with it, right? If you're a media organization, then you have some kind of legal structures in place to deal with this. But the chilling effect has a much wider impact. And sadly, there aren't that many bodies. You have the journalists associations that speak out, but the journalist unions are not very strong. And so there isn't that much by way of solidarity that one can expect other than statements from the usual suspects. In the old days, we would knock on the doors of the courts to get relief with pressure on free speech. But today, the courts also do not respond with alacrity. They do not respond with sensitivity. And the unpredictability of the judicial response when free speech is under attack has placed an added burden on the shoulder of journalists, but also academics and anybody who values free speech.
Does attention from, say, the global media, like Washington Post, New York Times, when they write about something, does that have some kind of a positive impact?
Well, I think it's hugely helpful. I think that coverage, because many of the constraints that in cases are not felt by global media houses, and I think that they need to. Of course, the government has made it harder and harder for foreign correspondents to operate. Kashmir, for example, it's much harder for any journalist from abroad to access without prior government permission. But I think they are still, the global media is well positioned, and I think those stories make a difference. And I think also overt acts of solidarity when journalists are under pressure, I think they also play a role. I think that, when I was targeted, for example, by Uttar Pradesh government in March and April, the fact that there was a statement issued by thousands of people around the world, I think even if it doesn't move the system, it certainly is very good for the morale of a targeted person.
Right.
And I think that's important. And so the global solidarity, both overtly as well as through actual honest media reportage, plays a great role.
Perhaps, I'm reporting flow in some sense. There is widespread expectation that this year's Nobel Peace Prize will go to media organizations like Reporters Without Borders. And I think if that happened, it would be a profound impact for journalists around. See, what Siddharth is describing is quite different from what's happening in the United States, where it's like as if people are pulled far apart, ripped apart into two camps. Is that how it is over there?
Yes, it feels that way now. The country is very polarized around this election. The Pew Research Institute, one of the good kind of social opinion survey institutes in the US, put something out recently that said something like 85% of Democrats think that this is the most important election that they can possibly imagine, and 85% of Republicans think the same way. So you have two camps that are mobilized with a offsetting and irreconcilable in some ways convictions about what the future direction of the country should be. Why is this happening? I mean, certainly Donald Trump has exacerbated something that was developing in the United States, pitting rural sensibilities against urban ones, flirting with white nationalism and white supremacy quite openly as a politics for the first time since we had segregationist presidential candidates in the late 1960s. And yet there is something deeper than Donald Trump afoot in the United States. It's been going on for 20, 30 years that Americans have been sorting themselves into like-minded communities, that there is less, there's a less willingness to live beside people whose religious views or practices are different from your own, or whose opinions about social issues, gay marriage, are different from your own. And so people have been clustering physically, and then social media came along and intensified that clustering by allowing people to live inside the virtual communities that they already agree with or belong to. So all of these factors building, and then Donald Trump comes in, and as he does with so many things, he just lit a match and threw it on the dry tinder.
Right. We're going to take some questions from the audience. This is addressed to both of you. The question is from Philip. Hello, I'm Annie, a journalist in India. I wanted to ask the panelists, there is a deep sense of distrust of media here. Much of it can be attributed to the media's own doing. But even so, there is a good number of journalists and media houses doing good work. How do you maintain trust in this environment?
Should I?
Siddharth, do you want to go first?
Look, I think the media is polarized in just the way society is. And the big challenge for those of us who believe in the ethic of journalism and its tradecraft. The great challenge for us is to stick to the rules and stick to what the profession is all about, which is to be objective, be factual, convey information as accurately as possible, but to try and avoid editorializing the news. So these are, so I think the public will reward and recognize those media platforms that are able to do that, rather than those who meld editorial opinion with news coverage. Now, most of what we see on television, for example, today, barring, say, NDTV, one channel, most of what we see is all opinion mongering in the guise of the garb of presenting news, and and people are pretty fed up of that, and they perhaps relate to that kind of television not as news anymore, but as some kind of entertainment, some kind of gladiatorial contest. But the challenge for the rest of us is all the more acute for that reason.
Okay. Steve, if you could address this question, the distrust has been growing over the decades now, the distrust, against a section of the media, perhaps. So it is such a valid question. How do you maintain trust in this kind of environment where there is distrust and, as I was talking, highly polarized? Even the media is so polarized.
Yeah, no, I think Siddharth laid out the right. I agree completely with what he said, which is that you have to recognize the environment is polarized. I'm not sure that trust is the right metric to judge journalism by right now. It's certainly an issue to talk about, but really the question is, can the press carry out its constitutional function of holding powerful individuals and institutions to account and to making transparent the impact of government policies, whether it's on the environment or on access to education, income inequality, and issues that citizens recognize are important in their communities and their lives. And I think, when I think about the noise and the polarization around the United States during these last few years, I also take note that fact-first investigative reporting can still change even the Trump administration's sense of what's possible. I mean, there was a minister, so to speak, in the US system of health early on in the Trump administration who had to resign because some Washington Post reporters followed around his private jet and found out that he was spending government money to fly around the country and have lunch with family members. Okay, well, even the Trump administration can't get away with that. And so the person had to resign. And again over the last few years, whether it's in the reporting about abuses of power by powerful men in Hollywood or abuses of office and corruption, the media plays a role that citizens, even in their polarization, recognize as valid and necessary to hold power accountable. So I think with Siddharth, where I end up, which is just go out there and find the facts and play it straight, and accept that not everyone is going to believe or trust what you say, but just have some conviction that over time, these kinds of facts and investigations can move the needle, and do, even in a polarized environment.
Mm. We have a question from Daniela Pinheiro, journalist from Brazil, based in Lisbon. Steve and Siddharth, where do you think we will be as an industry in 5 years' time? So now you have to be astrologers, not journalists.
If I take that first again, I think there's two parts to this question. And the first part is the moral, ethical, tradecraft part, which we've already answered, which is that we have to stick to what we're doing and do it properly and thoroughly and professionally. The second part, which is perhaps what Ms. Pinheiro is getting at, is the financial. And I think that this is a great challenge that media houses around the world have to confront, which is how do you remain financially worthwhile, financially viable in a situation of shrinking advertising revenue, a situation where readers are still quite reluctant to pay, and where the manner in which television or newspapers could fund themselves earlier is no longer an option in the digital world. So I think that here in India at The Wire, we have thought that going the non-profit way will help us to hold our head high and to raise money from readers directly, not allow our journalism to be compromised. I'm not sure how viable at an industry-wide level non-profit media necessarily is, but I think that it works for us, and I think it works for many other people around the world. And there are lots of other media startups that are playing around with innovative business models. But I think the future of media will also depend in large measure on how successfully we crack this, the business model side of things.
Steve, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just briefly. First of all, Danielle, hi, I hope you're doing well, and thanks for the question. I am reluctant to forecast, but to follow up on what Siddharth was saying, I think the biggest question that will shape where media are, certainly in the United States, over the next 5 years is the extent to which people are willing to pay for news, pay for journalism in a sustainable way. I have a kind of winner-takes-all environment emerging in the United States where times needed with a subscription-based business model that looks like it could work for an indefinite time. The Wall Street Journal, Washington Post are also succeeding in that direction, but a lot of smaller regional newspapers have not been able to persuade consumers of news and journalism to pay for it in a way that will make these newsrooms sustainable. And I think that is the biggest challenge. I do think there's a role for the nonprofit media. As Siddharth says, I don't know how big it is, but it's clearly established itself as part of the picture.
Steve, another question for you from Basilio Montero. And the question is, isn't the nature of news media government dynamics to be in tension, healthy tension? The adversarial relationship may have crossed the line by taking that approach.
It is meant to be adversarial, and I think journalists should be comfortable with being unpopular if they're carrying out their role and asking powerful people uncomfortable questions makes them unpopular. And I don't that you can expect a national leader, even in a democratic country, to just sit there and accept every criticism or every question from the press. Of course, they're going to try to get their own messages across. They're going to fight back when they feel that they've been treated unfairly, and the public will watch these interactions, this kind of tension, as you put it, and they'll make their own judgments. But where you see something categorically different in the United States now is a president who actively incites violence against the press. I mean, that's really no other way to put it. When he uses this language, it's not perhaps calling out fire in a crowded movie theater, to use the US Supreme Court standard for unacceptable speech under our First Amendment, but it's pretty close. He's calling out the press repeatedly as legitimate, as dangerous, as an enemy of the national interest. And that is something that, for all of the healthy tension between press corps and presidents, including in the Nixon era, which ultimately led to resignation, I haven't seen in my lifetime.
There's a question from Simon Lee. Do you think the pressure on journalists to use social media, the personalization of journalistic voices, that is first person in news stories, has contributed to the sense that the news is biased and can't be trusted? Which of you who will take up this?
I can take a stab at it.
Yeah.
I think, Simon, that's a very good question. And we grapple with this every day. And many news organizations have informal rules. The one that we like to follow is that it's one thing for an editor or a columnist to express her views on different issues on social media. But if you're covering a beat and you're a reporter, then it's best to not make it very personal or not be highly opinionated. I understand what you're saying. And there is a sense in which people then mark you out as in a certain way. But at the end of the day, the story that you file has to validate itself. And I think that this is a balance that most good journalists manage, even as they express a clear opinion on something on Twitter or Facebook. They are also capable of doing a story that checks all the boxes of professionalism.
Right, here's a question from HR Venkatesh from New Delhi. And the question is, have you felt a need for journalistic ethics to change to keep abreast of new challenges?
I mean,
Steve?
yes, we have. There are so many new challenges just to maintain professional practice that have been created over the last 5 or 10 years by new technologies, for example. The very subject Siddharth was discussing in response to Simon's question is really a new feature of the life of a professional journalist. How do you manage your personal profile? How do you follow the orders of your bosses sometimes to establish a visible following while at the same time retaining your independence and your credibility as a fact gatherer? Those two kind of imperatives of the modern professional reporter are very often in tension with one another. And I don't think that news organizations recognize how much pressure they're putting on younger reporters to speak out and develop, kind of a controversial profile, sometimes at the expense of their own institution. But that's just my opinion. There are many other examples of how new technologies are upending or presenting completely novel questions to journalists' perspective. For example, artificial intelligence and the manipulation of visual imagery. The computers are outrunning us in a lot of areas, and one of them is the way that we manage and distribute news.
Right. We have time for one quick question. This is from Anita Pratap. Do you think that the era of big corporate media, which is captured by the state in many democracies, is over, and now decentralized, smaller and people-supported media will flourish?
Well, the founding premise of The Wire is precisely that. I wouldn't say that corporate media in India has run its course. It's still very powerful. And in a way, power also is, it's very close to the state and easily suborned by the state. But new technology allows what were once small play. We don't think of ourselves as a small player anymore, but it allows The Wire and others like us to come up and flourish. And I think in many ways, this is, we are a permanent part of the media landscape now.
We have many young journalists who have, joined us online today. And what would be your advice to journalists who are in the line of fire from their own governments? Both of you all, I would like to get both your views.
Right. Steve, you want to take that first? I'll follow up after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult world today. I think some measure of bravery and conviction is going to be required to forge a career in authoritarian societies. We often advise our journalists, as we used to do in the Washington Post, that no story is worth dying for. But at the same time, every day you're managing risk, and figuring out how to do that in a way that is sustained, requires continuous communication with your family, with your editors, with your news organization. Above all, what I would advise is either stay independent and control your own destiny, or work at a news organization that will have your back when it matters. There are such news organizations, but they're not the majority. And I think increasingly those who are really going to do the difficult, dangerous work are sometimes better off managing their own affairs than tying themselves to a company that might sell them out to a government for business reasons.
Right. Siddharth, 30 seconds, if you can give us your wisdom.
I would say, number one, if you work for an organization, not given to pressure to do something unethical or something wrong, learn to stand your ground, even if it's going to take a cost on you, but also learn to pick your battles. So not every battle is worth resigning over or fighting till the bitter end. So learn to pick your battles, but if you stand your ground and stand for the ethics of journalism, it becomes that much more difficult for somebody to push you around.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much, Siddharth. There's been a wonderful discussion, and we've had a lot of very interesting questions from our audience. Thank you for being so attentive. The audience has been really wonderful with a lot of interesting comments and a lot of kudos to you both. So thank you very much for inspiring our online viewers. And back to you, Barbara. Thank you so much for the session.
Thank you. Also from me, thanks to Steve and Siddharth. This was a great session. And thank you, Anita, for wonderful moderation.